Hey Ross, how you doing?
I'm wonderful, and yourself?
Yeah, very well, thank you. So thanks so much for sparing some time for our Values Jam today, and I can't wait to get into it. So before we do that, could you please give us a short introduction to yourself and your passion and work?
Of course, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm truly honored to be here. I'm really looking forward to seeing what turns out. So my name is Ross. I'm currently in Ottawa, Canada, so on the East Coast, the Great White North, as they say. And my specialty or my background is in palliative and hospice care as a hospice chaplain, end-of-life researcher, looking for alternatives to pain management, holistic healing, things like that. At the moment, I'm working here in Canada, but I'm also on the global initiative of Dying Well. And what we do is we work in collaboration with global end-of-life care researchers, doctors, physicians to help better the palliative and hospice care facilities and support around the world. So working with Hospice Africa, Uganda, working in Barbados to help develop and build a hospice clinic there. And in that same process, working as a grief coach, a bereavement coach, spiritual coach, anything that I can do to better the process of bereavement. And something quite relevant in regards to the war in Ukraine right now, I'm working with an organization called PalChase, which is helping with pediatric palliative care for children that are being affected by the war in Ukraine. Obviously, hospitals, facilities are not available at this time or during this time. So getting the treatment for these children during their end-of-life journey, terminal illnesses is very, very much needed. So working on trying to help in any way, shape, or form, make that accessible wherever they're located in the Ukraine or outside during this time. So at this moment, that is me in a nutshell of what I'm working on right now. But I'm really honored to be here. I think this is an absolutely wonderful opportunity, and I'm very excited to see what transpires from this.
Okay, Ross. Well, let's dive in. I've got my Values Jam card deck here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cards out and give them a bit of a shuffle, and then we will select a card in some way. And like you say, let's see what happens. So I'm going to ask you a few questions to help us do this. How many times would you like me to split the deck?
Oh, great question. Let's do 3. That seems like a good number all of a sudden.
3, okay. And would you like pile 1, 2, or 3?
Let's do 2, please.
Okay, and then give me a number between 1 and 14.
I'm seeing 22 for some odd reason.
Well, that's not...
Oh, 14, I'm sorry. Geez, I've already had that in my mind. Let's do 10.
Okay. Whoa, okay.
Oh, that's a good start. Oh, wow, fantastic.
All right, so I think you know a little bit about Values Jam from our previous conversations, but we always start with this first question. We might choose a number of other questions afterwards, depending on how the conversation goes, and then we will end with a specific question. But the first question is, what does sustainability mean? What does it look, feel, and sound like?
Well, the concept of sustainability in a lot of forms is the sustainability of, say, the ecosystem or food sources. But I also consider sustainability in the realm of emotions too, as well. Keeping a sustainable mindfulness. So if someone says, can you sustain, or the sustainability of mindfulness, especially in the work that we do in end-of-life care, is keeping that sense of sustainability in the thought process, in the process of mindfulness, of spiritual support, emotional and mental support too as well. But, sustainability in the concept for all of us is in regards to food sources and sustaining, eco-energy, natural sources, things like that. But I also see sustainability in a broader aspect, especially in emotional healing as well. The one thing that we've learned through the pandemic and through traumatic events that are hindering our growth at this moment is sustaining a positive mindset through this all. And I am one as well that has these ups and downs of trying to sustain a positive outlook, We were just speaking before about wonderful, saying, keeping that mindset of everything is wonderful, even in this ever-changing, uncertain world that we're living in, is sustaining that mentality of everything's going to be okay. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling positive. But in some cases, it's very difficult to sustain that. And I kind of look at sustainability outside of the norm of that word that people would utilize, and kind of dive deeper inwards to emotional sustainability. That's my thoughts on that one. And the feeling of it to me is keeping it or sustaining it, holding it close, holding it tight. So am I sustainable to keep something very close to my heart, like love, compassion, kindness, sustaining that? And sustaining that ability to hold close compassion, kindness, self-love, self-care, self-growth. But also in the same time is being understanding and allowing yourself to understand that you may not be able to sustain it at all times.
Yeah.
But appreciate the ability to not only not be able to sustain it, but gain it back. So the process of losing something, but fighting for it to get back. And I think with that is so powerful, knowing that I've lost that joy in this present moment, but the next day having the ability to grab it and sustain it, saying, I got it back. To me, that's the feeling and the emotion and the conceptual understanding of sustainability in my mind, is losing someone, but getting it back and holding it tight, but also accepting that if you lose it again, you have that ability to take it back. You know, so when someone says to me, I've lost my control or self-control, losing it, but then gaining it back, that feeling of gaining back control of your happiness or your mindfulness, especially in this ever-changing world, is so powerful, because it shows that no matter what, even losing that control, you're able to gain it back and hold it for a period of time. That's my thought.
Yeah, you know, what you've just described resonates really strongly with me, because I kind of get a bit fed up with people talking about sustainability just in environmental terms. And like you, I think of sustainability much, much more broadly. And for me, it's simply about being able to carry on. You know, it's like carry on, carry on, carry on.
Yeah.
And when you talked about the emotional dimension, that made me realize that whilst in the past I've thought of sustainability in its broader sense, I hadn't really thought about what that had meant to me. And actually, what you said has made me realize and think about how sustainability is about our physical sustainability, our emotional sustainability, our planetary sustainability, our spiritual sustainability. You know, it's all of those dimensions. And ultimately, if we're not able to live in a sustainable way, we're kind of stuck, we're lost. No, it's going to come to an end. So who wants that? I was talking to somebody, it wasn't a values jam, but it was a guy, he's a finance guy, and he's big into sustainability, but more the environmental focus. And I just said to him, it seems to me that if we're not taking into account the impact that we're having on the world with stuff that we do, it's a bit like an owner of a factory not depreciating the value of the capital assets and not having a maintenance program for its really important air conditioning unit or whatever it is. And it was quite funny, because he, you know, although he's a really highly respected finance guy, and he said, you know, that's a really simple but great way to look at it, because, you know, our oceans do that job of that sophisticated building management piece, and yet what do? We don't do anything to maintain it and keep it working at its best. And then you were talking about the look like, feel like, sound like, and you were talking, I love that bit when you were talking about how if you haven't got it today, you can get it back tomorrow. And it made me visualize like the frequency of a wave, a sound wave, for instance, and how over time the sound wave is quite consistent, but actually from moment to moment, there's a trough and then there's a peak. And what you said made me think that, yeah, that's what we're like, a bit like that, you know. But when we're in a trough, it's like, that's okay, this can happen because, then there might well be a peak next, and over time it's actually sustainable, and that's all that matters ultimately. Wow, what a great start. And I love the way, Russ, you're able to, I don't know what it is with you. I think you must have a big brain because you're, well,
I'll agree with that.
well, it's just that you have a very, in my experience, unusual ability to be able to hold on to what you've been asked and then go quite some distance and maybe off of it and back to it. So I loved listening to your answer there.
Well, thank you. My school teachers would disagree, but there's another sustainability, is being able to wave off the track a little bit and then bring it back to the center where the discussion has started. But, sustainability, don't get me wrong, we need to do so much for this planet. We need to do so much for the ecosystem and nature and the food sources to make it accessible to everybody. But sustainability in my line of work, or in the space that we're in here with the palliative and hospice care, is trying to provide people that understanding of sustaining that mindset. Now, going through the process of grief and bereavement and the loss of someone during COVID and through this trauma of the war and everything that's going on in the world, we are sustaining a lot of emotions and we're sustaining a lot of feelings. Even if it's not really involving us, we're sustaining that. And that's okay too as well, but we need to understand to bring it back sometimes to where we began. Now, mindfulness of everything that's going on in this world is like GPS. If you start from your home and you click an address, it will give you 7 different ways to go. All are perfectly fine, all will get there. But just know that whatever path you take, you have to sustain yourself first to get there. So it's okay to veer off to different ways. It's still going to get to where you need to go, but knowing that you need to sustain the journey and the vehicle that you're in, which is yourself, your body, your mind, everything's aligned, that whatever path you take is going to lead you to something. And sustaining that kind of mindset during this hard times of the world and through a loss of a loved one or a loss of a job, a relationship, a family pet, a friend, is trying to sustain yourself on that mindful path of knowing that it will get better in time. Mm-hmm. Keep that sustainability in the mind, knowing that I'm holding dear and holding strong to this path. And it's okay for me to have bad days. It's okay for me to have good days. And it's okay for me to have very just leveled days. And I think a lot of people need to be kind to themselves. Mm-hmm. We are so much on emphasizing kindness in the world, but sometimes we neglect ourselves. Yeah. And we need to sustain kindness to ourselves, because to help the planet, we need to help ourselves first. My mom would always say to me when I was working in the community programs and I was like suffering so much because I wanted to do so good for the community. And she said to me one day, she says, "You will never be able to help another if you can't help yourself." Wise. And those wise words was, I try to sustain that in me at all times, knowing like when to step back and go, I can't push too hard today. I'm going to take it a little bit of a backward step, sustain the mentality of it's okay to say no, and it's okay to take time. And that's so important now with ever-changing world, is allow yourself kindness time. Be mindful of your own kindness. Take the time and say, hey, listen, you know what? Today I'm just going to take time to myself. I'm going to sustain a calmness and the ability to just say, hey, you know what? No, not today. Today is my day. And I think now everything that's going on in this world, we need a day to just sustain our own personal kindness to ourselves, because we are going through so much in humanity. Everybody is. But we need to be kind to ourselves. We're doing the best we can. We are trying the best that we can. We are working as hard as we can. We are doing things that may not be our joy, but we're doing it to sustain a lifestyle for our loved ones and our family. Be kind to yourself for that, because you're sustaining your family by working hard with yourself and outside of yourself. But you need a day to be kind to yourself too, as well.
Yeah, and there's two key points that you've raised for me there. The first one is about the kindness piece, and I totally agree with you. And so there's a couple of things. One is, I had a conversation this week, in fact, and somebody was talking about how they were hard on themselves at work in terms of what they achieved and whether they were a success or whether they were a failure. And it caused me to ask them the question around how we actually identify those words, success and failure, because who's to say what success is and who's to say what failure is? And I just suggested to this lady that she just consider it as data. You know, it's like, don't give it a label, just give it, you know, just what happened. And if that was to happen again, would you do something different? Could you do anything different, better or not? But it's not success or failure, really. You know, who's to say? That's such a judgmental view. And then you reminded me of somebody else I know who, this was a tree planting project that they started just before COVID-19 hit. And so they had these massive aspirations of how big the project would be, that was basically thrown out because COVID arrived. And the team basically came to the conclusion that, what's the phrase? It's something like, yeah, that's it. We can only do what we can do with what we've got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they said it was transformational for them, because once that had got through to them, they were no longer beating themselves up for this unrealistic target that had been totally changed by unforeseen circumstances that you have no control over. So what are you doing beating yourself up over that? So those are a couple of things on the kindness piece. And then you've made me curious about your work, actually, and I hope you don't mind me asking. I'm not going to talk a lot about your work, but when we're talking about sustainability here, it's just occurred to me that perhaps you've had an experience where people in a situation of either loss or in a terminal situation themselves are saying, what's the point? Why do I need to sustain myself? It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
Could you share something about that?
Well, I'll absolutely be honored to. And I'll use an example of myself. You know, in 2017, I lost my mom to terminal colon cancer. And at the time, she was diagnosed in 2010, and they gave her a diagnosis of 2 years. And she did a lot longer. She was very strong. And the one thing that I would take away from that, besides the actual loss, was at the very beginning, the moment she was diagnosed, the complete smile that she was on her face really threw me, and how she was be able to sustain that smile after being diagnosed with terminal colon cancer. And I said to her, I said, there's no way that you could be happy. There's no way you could sustain a smile. It's okay to be scared and sad. Please don't put on a brave face for me. And she says, well, I'm not scared or sad. And I thought to myself, okay, why? And she says, cancer won't define me, I'll define it.
Wow.
And I looked at her and I was like going, who in this world, not me, could ever think of saying that after being diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer? I in the work that I'm doing now, I've never met anybody that has looked at a terminal illness and turned around and sustained a positive attitude to the very end, even through the ups and downs. We're talking about wavelengths and sound and music. And then at the end, when it was her last moment of life, she, in her last breath, was still that sustaining that I did a good job. Her last words to me was, did I do a good job? And I said, yes, you did. You did an amazing job. And then she says, then I can go. And she left. Even at the end of her life, she sustained that ability to say, I'm still doing a great job. Even at the very end, she was still focused on looking good, feeling good. But then I look at myself at that present moment, thinking to myself, how can I sustain in any way, shape, or form joy and happiness through this? I've lost someone that was literally my rock, my everything. Ups and downs through the birth of me to the end of her life, she was my everything. And I thought to myself, I'm not strong like her. I can't sustain this. There's no way I can do this. But then a little birdie in my head told me, if you don't sustain this, you haven't learned anything from her. The moment she said to me at the beginning, I will define cancer, it won't define it. That was her way of saying, you're going to sustain some things. You're going to sustain some ups and downs. And when I'm gone, you need to sustain exactly what I said. That the loss of me as your mother will not define you. You will define it. And the moment it took time, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
But the moment I played this over and over again in my head, every time that I waved away and veered off the path and said, I can't do this anymore. This is not good for me. I can't live without this person. It brought me back to say, I can sustain that mentality. And I'm going to prove to her that her words on the end are going to stick with me. So every minute I do my job or my passion and my why in my space, I always remember that I will sustain the strength that my mom had when other individuals are going through that. And I help them with that mindset of don't necessarily sustain the pain of it, sustain the good of it. There's always light at the end of any kind of process we go through. I always consider it like a Disney movie. When a character goes into a dark tunnel, you get scared for a second. Then all of a sudden there's a little lantern and a little old man or woman is walking by saying, oh, hello. And they're walking through and you're like, oh, that's not scary. She's walking through with a lantern. There's that little bit of light. So I always say to people, yes, this is a traumatic event. And this is a high stress, de-stressing event. Sustain that little light of that individual. The moment you lose your way into the darkness, sustain that ability to remember the moments of positive and good. And her words to me at the most distressing moment in her life is the reason I am who I am today. And I've sustained that.
And, you know, it's, I don't want this to come across the wrong way, because what you've described obviously is a very sad moment. But actually, I'm thinking, what a privilege to have experienced that sad moment in the way that you did.
Oh, absolutely. And I 100% agree. And I guess that comes from the the mentality of myself of understanding different theologies and Buddhism and Hinduism and, you know, different kind of scriptures of the past, of understanding that 100% guaranteed that our life will end, but it's not truly the end. Everything is impermanent. Therefore, everything will circle back somehow. Keeping that mindset that when a leaf dies and falls to the ground, it becomes nutrients for something that grows again. It's that kind of circle. Yeah. So it took me time, but at the end of the day, it sounds strange, but I thank her for allowing me to be a part of that, because I think I wouldn't have been the person I am today if I wasn't able to be at her bedside. Yeah. I think if I missed her passing, yeah, I would see death in a whole other avenue. And I'm so glad that I was able to be there for it. So it was definitely positive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can also relate to the way you've described your mother, because it was International Women's Day. And so I did a post just saying, because I support women in their striving to be treated equally. I think it's really important. But as I was doing the post, I was thinking, well, actually, the one woman that I want to mention is my mum. And she died from motor neuron disease, which was a terrible time. But a bit like your mum, I remember her saying, getting ready to go to see the doctor and not being able to walk really well, but wanting to put her high heel shoes on and looking the part. And I remember saying, why do you go to so much trouble? You don't have to do this. And surely it's not that easy. And she was like, well, as long as I can, I will. Mm-hmm. And it's as simple as that.
The funny thing is I use this terminology all the time. They don't make them like they used to. My mom was a little Scottish woman from Ardrossan in Scotland, just outside of Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I think to myself, there's just no way us modern, or especially in my generation, would ever have that same mentality of like, it is what it is. I got to keep moving forward. We have learned so much, and I don't think we really truly appreciate when we spend time with our grandparents, our parents even now. When you think to yourself, they're talking about all these things, they're like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. And you think to yourself, the wisdom that they are producing is so prolific because of the way they've survived through horrific events. My grandparents who were in World War II, their stories that I didn't take seriously is a story of survival.
Yeah.
So again, sustainability, sustaining that information from them, talking about, hey, we went through this, we got through it, we stuck together, we are here now. If we really truly listen to the past, we would be able to do so much better during the time of turmoil that we're going through right now. But we never really listen to the truth, the evidence, and we don't sustain those historical thoughts that our grandparents were telling us, because realistically, even our parents, my mom, I would never listen. I was like, yeah, mom, okay, whatever. It wasn't until her diagnosis that I was like, I really have to listen more, because she's building me up to the point where she knows she's leaving and I have to be ready. And she wants to make sure that I'm ready. So I really focused on listening and sustaining every detail that she would say. And it definitely helped.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there as well. So it's really reinforcing to me how there's a strong relationship between sustainability and resilience. So it's this ability to keep going. And that's what sustainability is, keeping going, like we said right at the beginning. And then the other thing that you made me wonder is a question, which is about when you were talking about how it's really important to transfer that knowledge from generation to generation to assist with sustainability. It made me wonder whether actually some generations have not been very good at that, because they've not wanted to kind of share that bad stuff, and they've wanted to provide a better experience for the next generation. But in a way, actually, that's not been helpful.
Yeah, it's tough, because it's sort of like monkey see, monkey do, but not necessarily the case, because we are living in a world right now where I think we're so fearful of knowing the truth and understanding everything that's going on. And we put those blinders on. We have the mentality of turning things off, and we turn our minds off. And it's like end of life too as well. The moment you describe yourself in the space that I'm in, shut down, done. People don't talk about it. They're not willing to sustain that information because it's the fear of speaking of it. And that's exactly what you're saying, is fearing speaking of something because it may bring up something. It may open the door to something in your mind that you've never thought of thinking. It might open Pandora's box. And I think the more we realize that the reality of life is that we are on a wavelength, up and down, up and down, up and down. We have to understand that there is 100% guaranteed that we are born and we die. 100% guaranteed. That's guaranteed no matter how powerful and healthy you may think. In the between of birth and death is an opportunity of discussions and openness and understanding. But we also grow up in a world where death is scary. It's very scary. That movies make it scary, haunting and ghosts and all these things like that. We grow up in a society where death is scary. But life is described in the most beautiful way. But the thing is that they're both equally the same. We don't fear being born, but we fear dying. We don't fear coming into the light, but we fear going into the darkness. But at the beginning of life, we came from darkness to light. So therefore, if you think of it the opposite way around, then it's the case that when you die, it's going to happen again. It's that understanding. But and we are very good in this world in sustaining fear. And fear, in some cases, people are addicted to fear. They are fueled by fear, because if you're fearful, you're on guard all the time. But the problem is that when you're on guard all the time, you're reluctant and hindering positive things and things coming in, because you're wall guarding yourself, because fear is preventing anything from coming in and coming out. But the problem is you're not bringing in anything that could potentially remove that fear, because we're so guarded. And I think in like resilience too is a thing as well. Like a tree, you know, when you plant a tree, it's resilient. It goes through everything. We need to be like a tree. No matter what happens to that tree, it is resilient to survive. And it has not only itself to sustain, but it sustains so many other things. So it has to be resilient. So if you look at yourself as being a sustainable tree, like your tree planting story that you were saying, if we think of ourselves that when we sustain ourselves as strong rooted as a tree, we know that we are able to sustain life around us, our family, our kids, our partners, our work, our finances, whatever it might be. But it also sustains the alignment with our mind and mindfulness. We have to ground ourselves first. And I think there's such an important thing why I'm so enthralled by trees is once they're grounded, they're in and they're locked in and they are sustaining life that we never see. But inside, they are just simply soft material like us ourselves, but they sustain themselves and everything around them. And I think that's why we need to focus on ourselves of rooting ourselves to the ground and sustaining that, and everything will be fine.
Yeah, and just one addition to that, I think that the thing with trees as well is that, well, not in all settings, I guess, but I'm thinking that a tree on its own is kind of, I'm gonna contradict myself now actually, because I'm thinking of a tree where it does look magnificent on its own, but when you look at a tree in a wood or a forest, the individuality is totally unimportant. You know, they're part of something much bigger. Now I want to go back to when you were talking about fear. And just before that, what came into my mind was the importance of truth. And I was thinking about how perhaps with greater truth, it might be easier for us to create sustainability. But then when you started to talk about fear, I was thinking, oh my God, is that true though? Because you know, in some cases, the truth might be really even more scary than not knowing the truth.
Right.
So
yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the truth. It's the truth. You know, in some cases, I don't blame people, because I was the same, to not wanting to know the truth because of what it could potentially unravel within ourselves or outside of ourselves. I understand that. But at the end of the day, we need to understand and we need to sustain the realness of what is going on in our lives and everything like that. Because once we know the truth about what is happening with ourselves and around us, we are able to conceive that into results.
Yeah.
So I love David Attenborough. Everything that he does is so prolific and I learned so much, but I would not know how badly we are doing on this planet if he didn't produce the truth in a visualization way.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much we are destroying the simplicity of an ant that actually helps the ecosystem. I wasn't aware of that because in some cases I didn't want to know because I knew it would be bad. And two, I was fearful of knowing that me as a person potentially was causing this harm. But once I learned the truth of what was happening and what I as a human are doing to this world and ecosystem, I was able to find solutions to bettering that. Planting more dandelions, more flowers, more plants. I was able to find truth inside of that fear mentality.
Yeah.
But it was all because someone spoke about it. And I think individuals like ourselves speaking about this is another step forward of taking people's mind away from the fear of what potentially it is, and realizing that once you know the answer, the solution is there.
Yeah.
Because we fear in palliative and hospice care, like myself, we fear going to the doctor because we don't want to know what it could be.
Yeah.
And some people will neglect going to their physician or GP because they're scared of what it could be. But then working with oncologists and physicians, they say that is an understanding feeling of fear. We get that. But the thing is that if you come and hear the truth, there's a possibility that we could resolve this. If you fear coming in, I may not be able to find a solution. I would rather tell you the bad news, but we can work with this, instead of saying bad news, I can't work with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think from what you just said there, what strikes me actually is that ignorance does not change the truth.
Absolutely.
It's still there. It's just that you don't know it. And your example of David Attenborough, I had a similar example with an infographic that showed how much water it takes to create a piece of steak on a plate. And it was it's just like mind-blowing gallons of water that is needed to get this steak. So, and it was that actually made me take the action to eat less meat.
Mm-hmm.
Up until then, I'd kind of known that it was probably not as good for the planet and all the rest of it, but I hadn't seen the truth, the stark truth. And so, yeah, I think what you say is absolutely right, that even though the truth might be scary, it might be easier to deal with not knowing, but in some way that's even scarier. So better to know. And then, like you say, you have a chance to find out what you're going to do about it, rather than this blissful ignorance.
Yeah. But I mean, how many times have you heard ignorance is bliss?
Yeah.
It's because the fact is that it's easier to ignore something than to actually find out the truth. But the problem is when you ignore it, the problem unfortunately will resolve itself in a negative way. Unless you focus solely on finding a solution to that, the result may end up being something that you never could imagine, and not in a positive way. Yes, ignorance can be bliss, but at the end of the day, we have to look out the window and see what we're doing to this planet. Like, I live in an area where they're developing, and I witness every day them destroying trees left, right, and center. And I can't turn away from that. But I do know my neighbors who are saying, well, that's just life. You know, that's how the things work. And there's nothing wrong with being in that mentality of ignorance is bliss. But at the end of the day, 50 years from now, when we're on a planet with no trees, those individuals will be like, I didn't realize it was this bad. It's like, well, you did, but you chose bliss and instead of the truth. And maybe if all 8 billion people on this earth knew the truth about what we were doing to the sustainability of this planet, maybe all of us will have a light bulb and go, I'm going to do something. And 8 billion people within the next 10 whatever years could turn this planet completely back to the beginning.
Yeah.
But again, we have that mentality of, I'm just one person. I can't do anything. Yeah. I'm not that big. I'm not a politician. I'm not a billionaire or a millionaire. We can't do this. I can't do this by myself. And it's like, but here's the thing. I always say to people, don't have the mentality of trying to change the world. Have the mentality of changing the world for someone. Because if you change the world for one person or one thing, like one tree, that one person or tree can sustain 5 others. And I'll go back to David Attenborough, they did a scan of a forest under the ground, and they found that the roots of trees were actually intertwined with each other and sharing information. So it shows that if one person helps another person and they link, that goes on to other people. Yeah. But again, we are told in life, focus on yourself. You can't make a big difference. Just do you and everything will be fine. It's just like, but the truth is not that. Yes, you need to focus on yourself and better yourself, but you also have to remember that we must leave this planet better than when we came in. It's sort of like a tenant. You want to come into a home knowing that you're leaving this apartment better off than you would, originally do, or better off than you did. You want your landlord to go, hey, you know what? It's not as bad as I thought it would be. You did a pretty good job. You did some painting here and there. So leaving an apartment knowing that I'm leaving it in a better condition than probably it was. Even though I really didn't go out of my way to do anything dramatic and explosive, I simply just kept it clean. That did something.
Yeah.
It changed something. So you can make a difference in the smallest of ways that will ripple in history.
Yeah.
Because your action to do better for yourself and to do better for others on this planet will be remembered by others and rippled continuously.
Yeah. And it's this contrast between the individual at a specific moment in time, which is the mindset of so many people, it's me now, compared to over time rather than a moment in time, and being part of a collective rather than being just one person. And on sustainability specifically, going back to that truth and information piece, a lot of the communication is about what you can do. What if you did this, this would be the impact. But then, of course, people say, well, so what? That doesn't really look like very much, and it doesn't. So I think this was only last week, actually. I was talking to somebody about how, imagine if somebody said, okay, well, if you switched off the light every time you left the room in the dark, and if everybody in your city did that, this would be the impact. So making the messaging more about the collective achievement and outcome rather than if it was just you, so that you start to say, oh my God, if I was part of that, just think what we could achieve, which is totally different than this kind of personal burden. It's just about what I do. Okay. Now, I think you also know that one of these questions on the back of the card is ask your own question about sustainability. So how would you like to have a go at asking your own question, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how?
Oh, wow. There's so many thoughts that come to mind regarding when, in regards to sustainability. I'd always think to myself, even myself, when will I do more? When will I do better to sustain a better environment that I'm in? And I guess another thing is, when will this happen? When will this, we as a planet or we as individuals or groups learn more about sustainability? That's a great one. That one got me a little bit. I'm usually pretty good. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is, I always say to people, when someone says to me, I want to do something, and I always say, okay, when?
Okay.
I want to change the world. I want to help the planet. Yes, I want to help with sustainability of my mindset. When? When will this happen? And a lot of the point is that we can't answer that question when. We don't know. But the real answer would be is now. So I would say to myself, when will I sustain a better outcome in my own mindset? When will I make changes to better myself, therefore helping to better others? And I always say to myself, and I do ask myself, when will I do this? When will I take the time to reevaluate my own mindful sustainability? And I look at myself in the mirror and I say, now. Yeah. Now I'll do it. So if anyone's listening, if everyone's listening and thinking to themselves, it's easier said than done. Well, it is. It is easy. When someone says it's easy, yes, it is. It's just when. Yeah. When will you do this? I will recycle tomorrow. No, you can do it now.
Yeah.
Now is it? Well, I only have one bottle. Well, put that bottle in the recycling bin. When will you get better, and when will you start focusing on your own inner strength and health? Tomorrow? No, now. I don't have time. You do. You do have time. So I think the question for me would be when? When will I, or when will people realize that sustainability, not only for the planet, but for our own selves, is so important to do it now and stop procrastinating and saying when I have time? It's not when I have time, it's when will I make time?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a brilliant question, because when I see the initiatives around the world in this space, it always seems to be on the never, never. You know, it's like factory ships, for instance. You've got these massive vehicles on our oceans just sucking up everything that's around them. Why can't they just be banned now?
Yeah.
Why can't we just say the maximum size of thing that can do that is this, and that's it? You know, you don't have to wait until 10 years to be able to make that choice. Somebody somewhere could do that. And that, I also would add to the when is now and again and again and again.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention that is a friend of mine, Liz Murphy, she made a pledge at the beginning of COVID to shop locally. She wanted to help out people with local businesses rather than going to the major supermarket. But a few months later, we were on a call and she said, do you know, I said that I was going to do that, but I still caught myself in the car off to the supermarket.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you now, but I think there's something about helping ourselves to practice consciously over and over, because it's so easy to slip up.
Yeah. Well, every day is a day of self-realization, self-liberation. So we wake up each and every day liberated that we wake up. We wake up. And that is a moment in time that each day we have to find a way of sustaining that mentality that I can make a difference in this day. Yesterday is done. Tomorrow doesn't exist. Today I can make a difference. So when? Today. You know, and I totally agree with you, because we listen to the news and politics about things like this country is going to go electric in 2055. Okay, so that's the when. So people in that country would say, well, I won't be alive then, so I really don't care. Well, we're going to get rid of oil and gas by 2025 or some dramatic number. Okay, so I can still pump up my tank and pollute the planet. I always use the Great Barrier Reef, for example. 20 years ago, I'm going to say David Attenborough because he was the person, he told us that these ships are destroying the Great Barrier Reef. It's polluting it. You know, global warming is bleaching the coral reef. That was 20 something years ago. And he says we need to make a difference. And the governments there in Australia would say, well, we're looking towards the future 20 years from now to bettering that. Okay, well, why at that present moment couldn't you say every ship has to turn this way to deviate around it? But it took 20 years of pollution, destruction, and oil spillages for them to realize, oh, I guess we do need to do something. But if you took the advice of David Attenborough and all the scientists and the oceanographers and say, listen, if you just took the ships and deviated 1 mile this way, everything will be fine. But instead of making the decision to do it now, we said we will do it in time when we can.
Yeah.
But literally all you would have to do is tell the ship captain, say, hey, turn left that way. Instantly, okay, turn left. But we said in time we will get there. And the problem with humanity is we always say in time I will do it, or I probably won't be around that time, so it really doesn't make a difference to me now. But the thing is that that's an egotistical, selfish mentality, because you are not bettering the planet for yourself. You're bettering it for your grandkids, your kids, their kids, their kids. You're building a ripple effect for the future. So if you selfishly think to yourself that I can't make a difference now that will affect the well-being of then, we're going to be in trouble. And so I always think to myself, yes, we can now.
I think that's a brilliant note to bring this Values Jam to a close with the final question. So the final question is, what are you encouraged to do differently about sustainability as a result of our conversation today?
So many answers, but I will say the biggest one is as my granny would say, it's easy to say something, it's harder to do something. So I'm going to say that I'm going to sustain this mentality in this conversation that we had. I'm going to sustain it within me to realize that the words that I speak of is truth. And the words that we both have spoken, I'm going to sustain on a daily basis to know that when I veer off of the track or veer off of that mindset, I'm going to sustain what we've spoken about. So realistically, this conversation has been more towards helping myself sustain this mentality than it is for anything else. So I would say I'm going to sustain our conversation daily to make sure that I stay on that path.
Okay, great. And I'm going to do two things. I'm not big on social media, but whoever wants to read whatever I'm going to post, I'm going to direct them to David Attenborough and make the point that if we just listen to this guy and do what he suggests, then we could be in a whole lot better place. And then the second thing I'm going to do tomorrow is from the beginning of the day through to the end of the day, I'm just going to be really aware of what I do and whether it could be done in a more sustainable way. So whether that's recycling or whether that's the light off in the room or what it is that I'm eating, I'm just going to be highly conscious of that and maybe put myself into a position to make some choices for the future that are different.
Amen to that.
Okay, well, thank you, Ross, for a brilliant Values Jam. And
true honor. Thank you for having me.
Okay, take care.
Take care.